Previously on Rod, Rides, and Wrenches, we covered the indicators of a worn clutch, how to adjust your clutch lever and cable properly, along with some maintenance tips on lubricating the cable. We also ran through the different types of clutches you'll find on motorcycles and what makes them unique to one another. This week we replaced friction plates and springs on a multi-plate wet clutch.
So for this replacement, we need a new set of friction plates, as well as some new clutch springs, a gasket, of course, and then this little rubber seal right here is for the engagement mechanism at the top of the clutch lever. So our first step in removing this cover is to take the clutch cable off. You also want to make sure that you have slack at the top and it's adjusted to the point where you can get the bottom cable off. So in order to do this, you will need to take this lower nut all the way off of the threads. And when you remove the cable, make sure that you don't lose this nut. And then the cable will be able to slide out the cable holder right here. And the nut goes off the end. And the cable is out of the way. I'm going to put that nut up there and make sure that there's enough threads turned on so that it doesn't come loose. So now that the cable's out of the way, we're going to remove the bolts. Now these bolts can sometimes be different lengths. So I'm going to show you a tip to keeping them organized. So here's my trick to keeping all of these bolts organized and you never wind up accidentally putting the wrong length back. Now on this Triumph, they may all be the same length. I haven't taken this off yet, so we're gonna find that out. It looks like they're all the same length. But from time to time, you'll come across different motorcycles where these are different lengths. And so what I do is I roughly draw out the cover pattern with the bolt locations. So as we take these bolts out, like so, we'll just put it in the corresponding hole in the cardboard. And we'll fill that up, and then we can set the cardboard aside, make sure that we don't lose anything. Now one of the things you gotta remember when you take this cover off, the clutch cover off, on most bikes that have wet clutches, you're going to lose some oil. So we have our oil drain tray here at the bottom to catch that oil and hopefully prevent it from getting all over the lift. So now all the bolts have been removed from this cover. We're ready to take it off, and it may be stuck on there. There's obviously the gasket is holding the cover in place. It didn't just pop off when we took the bolts out. May require a little bit of force, and sometimes you can check around. There may be points, tabs for example, like I see here, where you can actually pry on the cover. So these are little tabs that are protruding out from the cover, like this right here. And we can get our screwdriver in there or pry bar and just kind of pry it open a little bit.
Now the first actual step should have been to revisit the shop manual on removal of the clutch for this bike. I've replaced dozens of clutches and thought I was pretty adept at it. After all, I've owned a few Ducati motorcycles, and that makes you pretty good at changing clutches. But this Triumph threw me for a bit of a loop. For some reason, the engine crank cover and starter gear has to be removed as well, since they cover and hide one lone clutch cover bolt that is tucked up under them. This was unexpected, and I didn't order the replacement gaskets for these covers, plus a replacement O-ring that goes on the starter drive motor. So this set finishing the clutch replacement back a few weeks while I waited for these back-ordered gaskets to come in from England. Not my proudest moment, for sure, but we didn't break anything and we learned a little more about this particular bike. Most motorcycles do not require you to order multiple gaskets and remove the starter drive to replace something as simple as a clutch. So just remember, this was unique to this Triumph I'm working on here. The clutch on the Honda that we're going to show you shortly is one cover and one gasket.
So one of the things I wasn't aware of until I had a second look is that there was one more bolt holding the cover on down here. And the only way to access that bolt, and this is again something uniquely British, so your bike, hopefully if you're doing your own clutch, will not look anything like this. I also had to take the engine cover off here in order to access this one bolt, which was way down in here, and I couldn't see until you took the cover off. So that off, this cover should now just pop right out. It's stuck there. There it is. All right. So now this cover is going to pop off. And there we go. We're going to look inside and see how the clutch lever mechanism works. What it does is it pulls this post right here, and that pulls the pressure plate away and allows the slippage between the clutch basket and the clutch discs. So all this just to get that off. So we're going to set that down. So one of the things you want to do now that we've got all of this area clear is we want to clean off the gasket surfaces. In other words, anytime you have a cover off of the engine, you've got to go back and clean up all of these gaskets. Okay, now that we've got our gasket surfaces cleaned up and we're ready to take this old clutch out, and we're going to do that by taking these 5 bolts out on the spring plate. Now I put the bike in gear to make it a little easier for us to get these off. And when you pull those out, you'll see the springs come with them. And those are the springs that we'll be replacing. And the last of the springs are out. Another trick that I use when dealing with clutches is to, once you pull that plate off, which is the outer pressure plate. So this one typically has a bearing in it. You want to check the bearing to make sure that there's no issues with it, that it's turning freely. A lot of issues can result in this bearing seizing up. Particularly with a hydraulic clutch, when this bearing seizes, you'll go through hydraulic actuators for the clutch. This one seems fine. I would expect it would with the mileage that's on the bike. It seems to roll real easy. Not too much in the way of problems. So that one's fine. We're going to leave that alone, and we can set this aside now. Now, the trick that I was talking about when it comes to taking clutches apart is to try to basically take these off in order and keep them in order. So you can consult the shop manual, of course, but one of the quick cheats is to just simply take them off in order. So there's a friction plate, there's a metal plate, there's a dry plate, I should say, metal dry plate. There's another friction plate, and another metal dry plate, and they alternate back and forth like that. All right. And that's the last friction plate. And then there you go. There's our clutch hub. There's our clutch basket through there. So how a clutch works is you have two sets of plates in here. You have the dry plates and you have the friction plates. Now the dry plates, as you see, are keyed to the hub. And this hub is actually connected to the rear wheel. This is what's driving the rear wheel through the transmission. So this goes to the transmission and then it goes to the rear wheel. And if we spin this right now, the rear wheel will spin because again, the bike is in gear. Okay. There we are. Friction plates are keyed to the basket. The basket is connected to the engine. So the power from the engine is basically being delivered on the outside to the friction plates. When your clutch is disengaged, in other words, your clutch is out, these plates are pushed together under high pressure by the springs, the clutch springs. And then they basically rub up against each other and drive. The clutch basket then is allowed to drive the inner clutch hub. Okay. When you pull your clutch in, this outer pressure plate releases, basically pulls outward, and it allows for these two items to spin independently of each other. In other words, there's no pressure on the drive plates against the friction plates, so they can turn separately. And that's why your bike stops when you pull the clutch in. So now that we have our friction plates out, we're going to grab the box of new ones. And you can see what a tremendous difference there is in profile, just with the naked eye, how much thicker the new plate is. So that, multiplied by 10 plates, is a lot of gap. So a lot of extra meat that we're going to be putting on this clutch. So the next thing we want to do is basically kind of pre-lube these new friction plates. And in the early days, they'd say like you had to soak them overnight or something. That's not really the case. All we have to really do is put them in some fresh oil and kind of get them lubricated up. Basically, you want to put them in wet. This is a wet clutch, so you don't want to have these friction surfaces completely void of oil when they first are engaged. And make sure that they're evenly coated when we put them back in.
Sometimes different manufacturers use additional components to help with clutch engagement or clutch chatter. The factory Triumph clutch that we removed today had what's called a judder spring that sat between the first few drive and friction plates. These springs help with engagement and clutch noise when the clutch is pulled in. The EBC friction plates that we're using as replacements today aren't compatible with this judder spring. If they were, a new one would have been in the box with our parts. Assembling the clutch with the old judder spring and our EBC plates will create clearance issues, making the clutch impossible to adjust properly. The other thing of note is that a number of multi-plate clutches, both wet and dry, particularly on European bikes, will have a unique first or last friction plate, or in some cases both. These plates are slightly smaller than the rest of the plates in the box and look different. If you don't put these plates in the bike in the correct location, you will also have fitment issues and the clutch won't work properly. So be sure to check your service manual or the clutch assembly instructions if they came with your box of new clutch parts.
So before we button this up, there's a couple things I want to talk about. And the first one is these drive plates. And the drive plates have a service limit on them. These ones, these are right around 3 millimeters in thickness. And that's where they are. But one of the things you want to make sure of is your drive plate is not warped in any way. Typically you'll see some heat stress on the drive plates. You'll see discoloration, bluing, that sort of thing. But if you ever want to check for warpage, basically you get yourself a piece of glass, a nice clean piece of glass, and then just lay the drive plate on top of the glass, and then you can check for any wobble or measure any deviation with a feeler gauge. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, on some bikes, there is a indication on the bolt holes. Like Ducatis are famous for this. There'll actually be a line through the spring bolt hole right here. And then you have to line that up with a specific hole on the pressure plate from the outside. And basically, if you don't line that up, everything sits out of kilter. So just be aware of that. According to the shop manual, there's nothing like that here on the Triumph. So, and it looks like they're all the same depth. Everything's the same depth in there, so we shouldn't have that issue. But just be aware that if you see a line cutting through that bolt hole right there, that it corresponds to a specific hole in the spring pressure plate. So now we can go ahead and put the spring pressure plate on. It slides on like so. And we have our new clutch springs. So let's compare them to our old ones. You'll see that the new clutch springs look a little heavier, for sure. You see that there's more coil wound a little bit tighter in them. So all we're going to do is get these springs in here and get them started. So now that we've got these bolts started, I'm just going to snug them up before we torque them. So these particular bolts, according to the manual, are torqued to 10 Newton meters. So we're going to use a crisscross pattern to tighten them up, or torque them up. Go back and just check them after we get the last one torqued. Okay, so that's it. Our new friction plates are in, our new springs are in, and now we can start to get ready to put this all back together. So now we have our trusty Honda VFR 800 up here. It's my 04. Last year I did have to put friction plates into this clutch. However, the springs were on back order. And what I did is I just buttoned it back up and with the new friction plates, and that made a big difference. But now that the springs have come in, we're going to change those out as well. And this will show you the difference between the clutch that we just worked on, which is has a cable and a mechanical lever to disengage the clutch and engage it over here. This is hydraulic. So on the hydraulic, what you have is a actuator on the other side of the bike, basically a hydraulic piston that pushes a rod basically all the way through the transmission to the clutch plate, which is behind this engine cover. So we're gonna start by taking this off and allow you to have a decent look at it. So now that we've got our gasket surfaces reasonably clean, we're gonna go ahead and take these springs out. But before I do that, I wanted to show you really quickly the difference between this pressure plate that's on this bike being a hydraulic actuated clutch versus one that we saw before on the Triumph, where it used a lever to basically kind of pry the pressure plate out.
What makes a hydraulic actuated clutch different and better than a clutch that uses a cable is, as the name suggests, hydraulic pressure that moves the clutch pressure plate through a slave cylinder. This means that there's no adjustment required like there is on a clutch cable. It's also then easier to feel your clutch, and you never have to worry about your cable stretching or being out of alignment. Although hydraulic hoses can leak or burst under severe stress, they typically last decades on a street bike, provided you keep the clutch hydraulic fluid clean and flush it every 2 or 3 years. Cables can fall apart, and this is more common, plus they can leave you stranded then in a tough situation. Riding your bike with a broken clutch cable is not a whole lot of fun. I've done it, unfortunately. So save yourself the pain and properly lubricate and adjust your clutch cable as we discussed in last week's video. While you're at it, if you have not already, please like and subscribe, plus by setting notifications for our channel, you'll be alerted of our next video. We have 2 new projects in the works right now that'll be sure to entertain and educate. Finally, if you have a bike that you'd like to see wrenched on, drop a comment, let me know, and we may be able to make that happen on our channel. When finishing up your clutch and replacing the cover, use a new gasket. Read the service manual in case there's any areas on the engine that require additional sealant, like an RTV. The Honda, for example, that we're working on recommends RTV where the engine crankcase halves meet. Use RTV as well on any other items that might protrude through the side of the case, if you have a sensor or other electrical component. In the case of our Honda, we also have an ignition pulse module that sits on the edge of the case on this VFR. Tighten up and torque your head bolts in a crisscross pattern to ensure you don't get any leaks, and replace your engine oil that you lost when you removed the clutch cover. And be sure to use brand new oil, or better yet, just go ahead and drain the rest of the oil in the bike and put a new fresh batch in. It certainly won't hurt the engine and may give you some peace of mind. Go ahead and adjust up your clutch cable if your bike's equipped with one, and then head out for a ride. Check out your handiwork. Let me know how things went for you in the comments section, and we'll see you out on the road. So, ride safe.